Here's some of the worst things I learned in medical school. Let's start with the elephant in the room, the cholesterol myth. Now, cholesterol tests are heavily relied on, and yet they're very inaccurate and quite frankly don't show the full picture. For instance, cholesterol, as Dr. Michael DeBakey, one of the fathers of heart surgery, always used to say, cholesterol is an innocent bystander. Cholesterol, he thought, and I like to think of it, as basically a spackling compound. So that if there's damage to the surface of a blood vessel from inflammation, then one of cholesterol's potential jobs is to patch that pothole and fill it up. Now, unfortunately, if the inflammation continues, then that pothole gets worse and more cholesterol has to be used as a patch. So rather than thinking of cholesterol as the troublemaker, the more we now realize that inflammation is the driver of why cholesterol might be sticking to blood vessels is very important. And sadly, most well-meaning physicians have not been trained to realize that cholesterol or the cholesterol ratios really have very little to do with heart disease or preventing heart disease. Sadly, I see many patients who have had their LDL cholesterol numbers suppressed by 1, 2, or 3 drugs, and yet they still have massive inflammation in their coronary arteries that we can measure, and they still develop new lesions that require a stent or bypass surgery. What's fascinating to me is that when we address the inflammation in blood vessels, the inflammation that quite frankly is coming from the gut, then we stop this progression of these lesions. And for instance, the guy who changed my life 30 years ago, Big Ed, reversed his blockages in his coronary arteries by doing just that. And the exciting thing is, for the last 30 years, I get to watch that almost on a daily basis. All right. What else? Well, we were taught that when we're thinking about calories, we think about weight gain, that the second law of thermodynamics says that basically calories are preserved. So calories in equals calories out. What does that mean? No matter how many calories you eat, if you don't burn up those calories by exercise, then whatever you don't burn up will be stored as fat. Sounds extremely illogical. The problem is the second law of thermodynamics does not work in a living system. And when I was in medical school, we thought of the gut as basically a hollow tube from our mouth down to our rear end, where food went in, magic happened. We would digest calories that we could digest, and whatever was left over was pooped out the rear end. We had no idea that there were 100 trillion microbes living in our gut that could potentially either eat a lot of that food that we were eating or could potentially actually make us absorb more of the calories from the food we were eating, depending on the type of bacteria that were in there. And it wasn't until fairly recently when studies showed that there were obesogenic bacteria and there are lean bacteria. For instance, we can take a rat model and feed them feces, stool from obese humans, these skinny mice will actually become fat because the obesogenic bacteria from that fat human totally changed how they absorbed food and the food that they were looking for. Similarly, we can do the reverse experiment. We can take fat mice and feed them skinny people's bacteria, and lo and behold, they become skinny, even though they're eating the same amount of calories. Lastly, we know from Italian athlete studies that we can put Italian athletes, in this case cyclists, on identical calorie diets. They eat the exact same calories per day. They exercise exactly the same. One group eats their calories in a 12-hour eating window from 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 at night. The other group only gets to eat their calories from 1 o'clock in the afternoon to 7 o'clock at night, a 6-hour eating window. The calories in the exercise were identical, but only the group that cut their eating window lost weight. The other group didn't, even though the calories in and the calories out was identical. So what happens in the gut, we're beginning to realize, affects so much more than just the old rule of calories in, calories out. And that takes me to the next point, that we just didn't know. That the gut is just a place where magic happens and we digest food and everything else that we don't need goes out the rear end. We now know that the gut is really perhaps the most important organ in our body, and that's our microbiome. And we are a symbiotic organism, that what happens in the gut is not like Las Vegas. What happens in the gut doesn't stay in the gut. What happens in the gut controls almost everything that's going to happen to us. It controls our mood. It controls our weight. It controls our inflammation. It controls our brain. And it controls most of the bad things that happen to us. And again, even though the father of medicine, Hippocrates, taught this to us 2,500 years ago, that all disease begins in the gut, it really wasn't until the last few years with sophisticated gut tests, sophisticated blood tests, that I and others realized that the gut is the key to good health now and good health later. And to paraphrase Alessio Fasano, the professor of gastroenterology now at Harvard, all disease begins in a leaky gut. And what I've been doing for the last 25 years is discovering that Hippocrates was right. And the good news is you can seal a leaky gut and you can reverse diseases by addressing the gut rather than patching up problems with medicines. I came from the era in the mid-1970s when broad-spectrum antibiotics were introduced. And they were, quite frankly, miraculous. Before that time, when someone developed an infection, let's just say pneumonia, we would have to culture the bacteria on a petri dish, if they were bacteria, and then individually test whatever antibiotics we had, whether they would kill that bacteria or stun it. And this would take actually many days if we were lucky, because many bacteria, we now know, don't grow on petri dishes. When broad-spectrum antibiotics came out, it was like we suddenly had an automatic machine gun that could, without knowing what the bacteria were, without knowing which antibiotic might be useful, we just basically hit the trigger and we killed off everything. And it was miraculous because now we didn't have to wait. we could hit them with this fantastic drug or drugs, and it saved a lot of lives. What we didn't know is that these antibiotics, while killing off the bad guys, also killed off the good guys in our gut. And remember, we had no idea how the gut worked. We just thought it was a hollow tube. We thought those bacteria were, they just live there. They don't do anything. Now we realize that those antibiotics are not harmless. They're not helpful except in dire situations. But we went from thinking that they were miraculous to using them to make our animals grow faster and fatter, putting them in our animal food. Little did we know that those antibiotics were in the flesh of these animals that we ate. We dispense antibiotics like candy whenever anybody comes down with something. Believe me, as a children's heart surgeon, I was at least once a month taking one or more of these broad-spectrum antibiotics to treat whatever interesting bug I picked up in the children's hospital. And little did I know that I was turning my tropical rainforest of my microbiome into a desert wasteland, all thinking that these antibiotics were helpful and harmless. In fact, they were killing off probably the most important organ system symbiotic creature that lives in me, my microbiome. Sadly, most medical schools do not yet teach about the microbiome. Most medical schools do not teach nutrition. My medical school class on nutrition was an hour. And that was, guess what? There's carbohydrates, there's proteins, and there's fats. And that's what we were taught. The average practicing physician uses information that is 20 years behind current knowledge. And I see this all the time. And we do have continuing medical education courses that are required. But we have to realize that most of the continuing medical education courses are funded by drug companies. And most of the research that's done in most medical schools is no longer funded by the NIH or the American Heart Association or the American Cancer Society. It's funded by drug companies. And that's something that we didn't realize could possibly happen. But it is happening still to this day.